to go.
All right.
Hello, I'm Carrie Rackett, and I'm a collaborator at the IRA Project. We would like to thank again President Simmons for her generosity and time and spirit today, and for her insightful and inspirational remarks. Racial equity and justice in this country has been profoundly impacted by President Simmons' lifetime of brilliant work and leadership. Thank you, President Simmons. And now it's my honor to introduce the moderator and distinguished panelists for our next panel, Bridging the Private Sector and Nonprofits, Philanthropy in Diversity and Inclusion. This panel will share their experiences working in consultative and collaborative efforts towards goals of racial equity, what creates success in these relationships, and where there are persistent stumbling blocks. Dr. Megan Ming Francis joins us as moderator. Dr. Francis is a senior democracy fellow at the Ash Center at the Harvard Kennedy School and associate professor of political science at the University of Washington. Dr. Francis specializes in the study of American politics with broad interests in criminal punishment, Black political activism, philanthropy, and the post-Civil War South. She's also the author of an award-winning book, Civil Rights and the Making of the Modern American State, and is currently at work on a second book project that examines the role of convict leasing in the rebuilding of Southern political power and modern capitalism after the Civil War. Our panelists are Ms. Lori Villarosa, is the founder and executive director of the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, whose mission is to increase the amount and effectiveness of resources aimed at combating institutional and structural racism. Ms. Villarosa has been working at the intersection of racial justice and philanthropy for more than 28 years at the local, national, and international level. She has and continues to serve on the boards of a variety of prestigious foundations and nonprofit organizations, both in the US and internationally. Mr. Theo Vanderloo is the former CEO of Bayer in Brazil and the former president of Sharing Spain. He recently founded Nevele Consulting, which provides advisory support for projects in the healthcare area, and Nachu Science Laboratorios SA, a startup focused in botanical science for human healthcare. During his career, he's been recognized and awarded multiple times for his advocacy and leadership in diversity and inclusion, particularly within the pharmaceutical industry. Ms. Michelle Wonsley Ford currently serves as the executive director for the Center for Racial Justice in Education, a nonprofit supporting educators, parents, and other leaders in dismantling systems of racism in their institutions. Prior to this, she led people or operations at donorschoose.org and is the founder of London Plain Advisory, a consultancy that supports senior leaders in developing a racial equity leadership competence and anti-racist practice. I now hand it over to Megan. Thank you all.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm gonna just wait while my other esteemed panelists join me right now. All right, and I think we have, okay. All right, I think we're all here, everyone. So first off, thank you so much to the IRA Institute at the Harvard Kennedy School for organizing this important conference. And second, and perhaps most importantly, especially because we are in this space and gathered online, my deep appreciation to my four esteemed panelists for taking time out of their incredibly busy days and joining us to have this conversation. So what I'm going to do is just spend maybe about a minute or two kind of setting the stage, and then we have three questions that I'm going to throw to the panel to try to get their perspective about from where they actually sit, to think about in some ways kind of where we've been and where do we need to go. And then we're going to open it up to the audience. So if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the, I think it's the chat window. I'm still learning Hopin. Okay. All right. So first, let me say that this has been a year like no other. I have the fortune, and sometimes it seems unfortunate, to be an American political scientist who studies American politics. and constitutional law, this has been an interesting time to be somebody that focuses on those issues. It is also true that we are coming out of a spring and summer like no other. I'm also somebody that focuses on the Black freedom struggle in the United States. And it goes without saying that in the United States and globally, what we've witnessed are historic protests and demonstrations about policing, about systemic racism, about deep structural health inequalities that COVID and the health pandemic have in so many ways magnified. And so for the first time, many people are reading things that they have never read before, having conversations about systemic racism in this country and in workplaces, private, corporate, as also in the nonprofit sphere. And it seems that many are struggling with what has happened in the past, in some ways the lack of progress, as well as what to do and how to strategize about how to do things better in the future. And I can't think of 4 people that I'm more like to kind of hear from on like in this moment. And so the first question, and I'm going to also warn the panelists as well as the audience that I have not given the panelists enough time to answer any of the questions that I have set forth. And so this first question is, from an institutional perspective, what has racial equity work looked like in your sector? Because I know that all of you sit in different spaces. And how have you envisioned or created successful partnerships with people and organizations doing this work in the private sector? And of course, this begs the question about what exactly is a partnership. And if you guys could take 1 to 2 minutes to answer that question, that would be fantastic. In my screen, I'm going to go, if that's okay, Michelle, Theodore, Lori, and Mia.
Awesome. First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to just sit here and be in conversation with you all. I, like you, Megan, am really interested in hearing what other folks have to say. Since joining the Center for Racial Justice and Education, much of what you said in terms of a time like no other, that really resonates with me. What partnership has looked like historically in the sector has really varied, right? And because we are specifically at the intersection of racial justice and education, it has looked like policy work, it has looked like folks organizing, it has looked like, us doing training and development with organizations, primarily in schools, right? And so that has been public schools, it has been independent schools, private schools, charter schools, but partnership has not been as robust, we'll say, as it could be. And, just super quickly, we, like any other nonprofit in the US, particularly in New York, really were challenged as a result of COVID. And, had to make some tough decisions as COVID hit our organization. We were already challenged, but, having to let folks go a couple of days before the nation erupted in protests and we had so much traffic to our website that it continued to crash is really an indication of the kind of support that organizations like CRJE, organizations that do racial justice work every day, all day, have been doing it for decades on end, really need to be in continuous conversations. So, we're just working very hard to really relay the message that this is not seasonal work and it's not trending work, but that it's something that really needs to be on the consciousness all the times with the folks who are closest to decision making.
Great. Theodore? I don't think I can hear you.
I'm sorry, I was muted. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. As you can see, well, I have a Dutch name, but I'm actually born and raised in Brazil. But my parents are Dutch, so I'm a Dutch Brazilian. And I have a long history. I won't get into details, but I've lived in many countries in Europe and also in Latin America, and so I've seen a lot of things. And in the case of the diversity, in my case in Brazil, I started to engage into this about 6 years ago, when nobody was actually doing anything openly. you could see many groups of Black people getting engaged, but the companies were not really listening. And so in my case, I'm not an institution. I work for a big multinational, but I can tell that my experience was initially that what we needed to do as a company was to listen with empathy to what the Black community had to tell us. Because in Brazil, about 56% of the population are Blacks, but you don't see them anywhere in the companies, in the offices, hardly. You will see them mostly in the factories. And this is really, in the case of Brazil, it's no longer acceptable. So what we are feeling at the moment is that we're starting to make progress, also thanks to the social media, because it's irreversible. And so what we're trying to do now in the companies, we're bringing in experts, people that are engaged, Black people that have their own companies, getting engaged into inclusion and diversity, to talk to the people in the companies, and also to look into the companies to see exactly what they have in terms of diversity and how they can help them evolve as a company. And so this has been a very interesting and a very rich journey for me personally as a human being, because doing the right thing makes you feel really good about it. And also, for me, the biggest challenge is to get other CEOs engaged into this, because it has to come from the top. The top really will give you the trend of what will happen in the future. And so this is my lesson learned, that the top management has to be engaged. And I've been doing this since I retired 2 years ago. I've been talking to many C-levels, executive boards, to try to persuade them and to convince them that diversity, it's in addition to being fair and just, it's also good for the business. So this is what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Shall I go next then?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank you for everyone for having me. And it's nice to be in this panel with all of you, especially Megan. I don't actually work on diversity, and in fact, when you think about with our work in the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, I was glad that in the introduction, Carrie said the specific mission, because it has been around increasing the amount and the effectiveness of resources aimed at addressing institutional and structural racism. And I start with that by recognizing that, of course, having broader diversity within the sector is critical to that. But we also know, and we have seen over and over again, where it doesn't necessarily shift what's actually happening in terms of grant making and who is the recipient of grant makers. So it's one of these like necessary but not sufficient points. In terms of what's been happening in the overall sector, 30 years in 2 minutes will be difficult to say, but I would say that one of the things as it relates to this topic is that we were actually having traction with those who were doing anti-racist work and doing more organizing and being more emphatic around our goals of structural racism when, frankly, some foundation presidents and consultants came in with a new diversity in philanthropy project, and then we ended up having to backtrack. And it was interesting because it was the kind of language at the time that, yes, was new for some people, but frankly was not new for things that were happening, in the 80s or the 90s in a lot of even not that progressive foundations. But this entity that came in, and I'm lifting this up because I think we have this cycle a lot, that we cycle back in ways that actually seems like it's expanding, but in fact it's causing us to tread water or even have to swim against a current that's going in the different direction. And the 2 minutes went so fast. So I will say the one thing that I hope we get into more is when we think about who has to be shifted, where the power lies. And I mean, it was incredibly sobering hearing some of these earlier sessions. I was only able to come into some, but what was really striking me was all of the failures that particularly Patricia was talking about earlier. get so framed as if it's the failure of those doing the training. And yet I think about our messages about like, why can't Johnny read? Or when we think about failures in racial disparities in school, these same people who were going to trash some of these programs, I don't think are taking any responsibility for why can't you learn? Why can't you change? What's going on with you? So thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Lori, for that. Before I head to Nia, I actually just want to provide a brief introduction in terms of her incredible work. So I taught a course at the Kennedy School last spring called Philanthropy and Social Movements, Will the Revolution Be Funded, ? And the students did a podcast series for it afterwards. And throughout that class, we were trying to kind of problematize what many might perceive as a traditional philanthropy model. And the students always told me, like, the one organization that continued to come up with the students is the Boston Ujima Project. And we have Nia Evans is the director of the Boston Ujima Project. Her educational background is in the areas of labor relations, education leadership, and policy. Her advocacy includes the focus on eliminating barriers between analysts and people with lived experiences, as well as increasing acknowledgement of the value of diverse types of expertise and policy. Because of the insistence of my students, I did spend a lot of time on the Boston Ujima's webpage, as well as the work that you've done, and just really think it's incredible. The work is highlighted for the students in the podcast, episode 7, Untie Knots. It's called Transforming Wealth Inequity Through Anti-Racist Funding. And what comes clear in that episode is that, like, seemingly there's this new focus on, like, what does anti-racism mean? What is anti-racist funding? But y'all have been doing that work, right? So I just want to kind of say that, and then now turn it over to Nia Evans.
Thank you so much, Megan. And I just want to say a big fan of yours, Megan. So I am geeking out at your admiration of Ujima. Yeah, so as with Lori, I know two minutes goes by fast. Time is tough for me as I ramble, so I will try to say what I'd like to say quickly. And I felt actually that the best way for me to answer this question was actually to highlight some of our peers. And so one of the things that I really try to make sure that I do in this work within Ujima and outside of Ujima is really point to the collaborative and the cooperative nature of our work. So I try not to move as a single charismatic leader that I think a lot of us are used to in our communities, and then likewise on the organizational side, really be cognizant that we're moving within an ecosystem. We're part of a movement, and so there are a lot of people in addition to us doing great work. So one organization I just want to talk about really quickly is Boston Impact Initiative, another local organization. We consider them our sister fund, and I'll say the sector that I'm talking about is finance, impact investing, and they've been leaders or influential in defining impact as racial equity within the impact investing space. So that's one of the ways that has looked here, is to move beyond ESG, environmental social governance, and to say racial equity is a fundamental ingredient of impact. The second org is another org that I love, EBPREC, East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. They're in Oakland, and they work to take housing off the market. And so they work to help residents in East Bay of Oakland invest in a collective fund that then purchases property, and they have stewardship and cooperative ownership of that property. Not only that, generally the properties that they purchase are properties owned by BIPOC families. Those properties are usually endangered, and it allows those families to keep their wealth, to keep that property and to keep their wealth. And then finally, Ujima, as Megan has said, I think we do some interesting things with racial equity. The couple of things that I'll talk about is our good business standards. So again, just as I've talked about how impact is defined, what I should back up and say is we invest in explicitly businesses owned by people of color, and our investment criteria uses good business standards, meaning businesses cannot receive investment from us unless they meet these standards. They are non-negotiable standards. They include businesses being owned at least 50% owned by people of color, at least 60% of employees are people of color. Workplace policies center the safety and success of queer and trans women of color. They practice CORI-friendly practices, meaning your criminal record does not count against you for employment. And they commit to the Sanctuary Business Pledge to protect immigrant workers. And that's just the racial equity piece. And then on top of that, we have an impact piece, which is commit to a green energy plan, commit to a zero waste plan, commit to a yearly community benefits plan. And those are just a few of 36 minimum standards. The other piece is the Ujima Fund, which I would say we have tried to build in structural equity in terms of the returns that we try to allocate to our working class investors. We aim to allocate the highest returns to our working class investors. So we aim to be redistributive in that manner. And we also have made it very, very accessible with a minimum $50 investment. And so with the design of our fund, we're grounded in a reparations frame. And I'll stop there, and I don't know how much time that was, but it feels like probably 2 minutes is up.
Well, that's excellent. And I want to hear more about this reparations frame later. Okay, so this has been kind of, I think, a fantastic set of issues and ideas already on the table. The next question kind of pushes us to think, I hope, about the aftermath, and it's still, I think, the ongoing. So I think maybe aftermath is perhaps the wrong word here. But there's been obviously a spring, summer, as well as now fall protests after the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and they have brought out how deadly institutional racism can be, not just here in the United States, but globally. And it's also, I think, highlighted the urgency of the private and nonprofit sectors to do more to confront the present crisis, right? Like, there was companies and different also foundations who I never ever thought would come and make a statement. Granted, it was only a statement, but maybe that was a tiny bit, right? But there was a number of institutions, nonprofit and private, acted in ways that I had not seen them act before. So everyone here on this virtual panel has thought deeply about racial justice, as well as what it might mean to shift power and structures. And so my question for the panel is, what will it take for things to be different this time? In what ways does the private sector or nonprofit sector need to change to be more in step with Black and Latinx-led social movements? This time, if it's possible, I want to do Lori, Nia, Theodore, and then Michelle. And for this one, you guys have 2 to 4 minutes. And I'm going to be hard on that 4 minutes, though, okay? So.
All right. Thank you. All right, I've got my timer set too. So I've actually been in philanthropy through these different cycles. I came in right before the LA uprisings in 91 is when I started my work, and I was very young. But I really saw the waves of the movement of the conversation there, and the need to shift from the why can't we all get along as the solution. For a lot of people, it was still a wake-up call. And I would say for, obviously mostly a lot of white people, it was a wake-up call. But I think there was also a mix of folks who had felt like they had gotten to a certain place and there hadn't been as much conversation. And then we get to Ferguson and we get much more explicit around the importance of supporting Black-led organizing, which actually the field of practitioners had been recognizing for a long time and had been lifting up. And I reference that because there's something that happens all the time where the lag is where we get to the least common denominator, not only catching up, but then shaping and framing the narrative. And I think we need to shift that at this point. So that's what happened with Ferguson. And we had a lot of pushback, a lot of excitement for one moment, but then it started splitting even more. And where I see us now, this erasure of history, this, on one hand, the irony of complaining about the erasure of history by our side saying, pull down the Confederate monuments, but on the other side, them wanting to stop any kind of training or teaching or anything that gives more accurate history. They're playing with it in both directions. And we need to ensure that the frame, that the message that rides through most is the one that is most relevant to those communities, Black and Brown and Indigenous communities who are living the issues. And that's where I feel like centrists, and maybe I'll put the private sector in there. And I will say most of my focus is on the philanthropic and nonprofit sector, and less so the private sector. But what we're seeing is there are a lot of private sector agents jumping in, considerable ways. We've got more than $1.5 billion pledges from different companies that they're saying is going to be around racial equity. The question will be, how does that get framed? Does it get framed in a way that is actually responsive to and addressing what the Black and Brown communities are calling for? And especially if the idea is that they're doing it in response to these issues, then why aren't you then in turn having your solutions be what is getting called for? I see I just have another minute left. So I will say that one aspect about also how to make it not be different is we're tracking what is actually being given. So not just these pledges, but then we're going to do more to really thread through, all right, you said this, then what are you actually doing? But I'll see the rest.
I was like, use that extra minute, Lori. Great. Thanks so much, Nia.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Lori. So I was not able to attend the rest of the day, but I was able to catch the last 15 minutes of Ruth Simmons's remarks. And so I will reference what she talked about, which is truth. So I think the title of this conference, Truth and Transformation, is apt. And so I think one of the things in thinking about how does this become different this time in a way that's enduring, and Lori, you've touched upon this a little bit, is I think of the role of having a sober-eyed assessment of how we got here. And I think some of us, and when I say us, meaning the American population, some of us have that capacity, and largely it's those of us who've been on the experiencing oppression end of things. So some of us have that capacity, and some of us are doing this. I'm thinking about all of our Black scholars, most recently, and in terms of mainstream national conversation, there were 16, 19. But I think that this is a process and a necessity that is delayed by what I would say is individual, collective, institutional ego and defensiveness. And so I think let it go. And I think that the kind of metaphor that I would like to use, or frame of reference, is as individuals, I think a lot of us undergo kind of existential processes, personal journeys where we're trying to figure out who we are, and we're trying to be kind of the best people that we can be. So that's kind of a frame of reference that I'm thinking of. And I'm thinking at the national level, we need to do that collectively. But the difference between a collective and an individual journey is, as I said, those who are holding on to a mythic past or whatever it is that they are holding on, they hold us up as a collective. So I think that that's huge. Is just committing to let me get over myself, let us get over ourselves, and let's look again sober-eyed at how we got here, and let's not be so reactionary and so defensive. The second thing I think is a long view, and this is probably definitely very familiar to you, Lori and Megan, in kind of commenting on the philanthropic sector. And of course, as a nonprofit org, we are engaging with philanthropy all the time. And so I definitely think one thing that also has to be different is committing to a long view. And I think kind of really grappling with our history. So understanding it took us centuries to get here. It shouldn't take us centuries to undo it. And we shouldn't be trying to speed through it. And we should be honest about why we might have an inclination to try to shortcut it or speed through it, and differentiate between what's legitimate urgency and what's urgency that's self-serving. And then what I would say, and I have no idea what's happening with time, so this is going to be my last thing. What I would say finally then is hopefully we then arrive at a common view or common understanding that we need to make substantive long-term investments of various kinds in communities that have been neglected for centuries. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, and you had 10 seconds left, so that was fantastic. Theodore? I think you're muted again. Come and talk to me.
Yeah, okay, here we go. So I'm relating again to the situation in a country like Brazil with, I mean, we're the biggest nation, Black nation outside of Africa. Yeah, so it's, and I must say now that we are really reaching a point where there's a very big awareness that something has to be done, not only in the case of racism, but also in the case of inequality. In Brazil, we have about 1/4 of the population, they live below the misery line. And 74% of these people, they're Black origin. And also the other issue that is coming up now is the education. The official government education in Brazil is very poor. Usually people that have money, they go to a private school where you don't see any Black people, hardly. And so you get this segregation all the time in Brazil. And now this awareness is now growing that something has to be done. And what we're also noticing, for example, is the promotional campaigns on television from products, from companies. Everybody is now including Black people. In the past, this did not happen. So, and I think this is a very good sign that this is coming forward. The other part in terms of training executives not to be biased during the interviews. Companies are now engaging more in attracting young talent, Black talent. And for example, I can state two companies, Bayer and also Magazine Luiza, which is a Brazilian retail store. They're now doing trainee programs exclusively for Black people. So only Black people can get into this program. There was a big discussion, it's still ongoing, about whether this is legal or not legal, but it is legal in Brazil because in Brazil we have laws that we need to favor the Black population for a certain period of time because they have lost a lot of opportunities in the past. So there are some laws in place that allows us to do this. And as all this discussion is coming up, which is very good for our society. In terms of, and also of training, it's not only hiring Black people, but also promoting Black people in the companies. And I think this is another bias that companies have to promote people to a higher level. There's always this fear, and this is what I notice in my own experience. Companies have to take risk and promote also the Black people, even if they feel they're not totally prepared, because they will find a way to do it. It's just a matter of trust as well. And so all of this situation is now being discussed in Brazil. And I think also that bringing the Black activists that are now also engaged in Brazil closer to the companies to discuss this in the companies, in meetings, this will be a big step forward. So really, I would say that this is what's happening in Brazil. And I'm looking forward to the next years to see how this will develop in the future.
Great, thank you so much. Michelle?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things I'm really struck by in terms of the insights of the rest of the panel is just how complex and how nuanced what we're talking about is, right? So we've talked about organizing, we've talked about the responsibility of the private sector in terms of senior leadership in the C-suite. We've talked about the responsibility of the world of philanthropy to fund the initiatives and the experience of the people that are closest to the problem. And part of this, you know, all of this really kind of hinges on, I feel like, three things in particular. One is, you know, the sober look at the truth, right? That you're talking about, Nia, right? That to me, it feels like there's got to be some form of an acknowledgement that we are now officially in a period of reckoning, right? And that this reckoning is long overdue, that it requires that we take that sober look, but that we also acknowledge that harm has been done, right? And the harm that we're talking about with respect to racism doesn't even acknowledge, you know, the first harm, which is that all of this is taking place on stolen land, right? And we somehow can skip over that part even in our analysis, right? So So there's a piece of this that is about critical analysis, which is a shared understanding of history, a shared understanding of the theoretical underpinnings that help us make sense of history, and then to apply that understanding to a contemporary context. Why did we have LA in 91? And, you know, Laura, you talked about being young when that happened. I remember being at a predominantly white school on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, founded for girls, surrounded by teachers who said they loved us and demonstrated that every day, but no one had the capacity or the capability to have a meaningful conversation around race. And these are people who had marched with Dr. King, who had been on the front lines of women's liberation, you know, and so there was not that ability to engage the analysis in a meaningful, practical way, you know, within an education context. The second piece, and I think, Theo, this is part of what you're talking about, is we've got to understand that all institutions, all organizations functionally exist first as systems. We are not, you know, first a culture or a society that, you know, that just sort of organically somehow gets created, but we are a system with agents and actors. There are beliefs and values and experiences that we bring to the table. There are power dynamics that exist and relatedness that informs the way in which resources flow, that inform the way in which decisions are made. And so if we can acknowledge that there is history that we don't know and understand, and ways of being that we have together that we don't know and understand, then we can move into something that feels, you know, frankly, more rooted in my recovering human capital consulting days, which is like, there's got to be shared codified language around what is competency-based behavior change at the individual and the institutional level look like, right? So CRJE, you know, does its work primarily in the space of training and development. And we have been having this conversation for years and years with schools and school systems and youth-facing organizations to say, this is not about a 2-hour training. It's not about a 6-hour training. It's not about a book, an article, a podcast, a panel, a workshop. The work is not the workshop, right? This is a sustained effort that requires that people in all parts within that system have a shared critical racial analysis, and then also are able to share language relative to what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, and how we're going to iterate on the things that we have done, right? And what is missing is this reflection and honest reflection around who we actually are, right? And so one of the ways in which I think it would be really powerful to promote a public and private partnership is our American government for centuries has failed us as a populace. There is a way in which private sector can come together and push the change that needs to happen out into our culture, because we are in a capitalist society. And for whatever else we very much value as a nation, our dollars, right? And so what does the C-suite have to say relative to, this is what we believe in, this is our diversity statement, this is our chief diversity officer, these are our recruitment numbers, this is how many professional development workshops we offer, and also, this is the truth commission that we, the CEOs of the Fortune 500, have put together to get to the root of who we are as financial services firms, as consulting firms, as consumer package companies, in terms of where our money comes from and whose backs on which that money has been acquired. So there is a real reckoning that has to happen both in the public square, but then also in the private sector relative to how the private sector has come to be in the first place.
Fantastic. I mean, it strikes me that in all of the 4 comments, they were all incredibly rich, but they all touched on the importance of kind of present actions being informed by an understanding of past harm, right? And I really also appreciated, Nia, you mentioned kind of the long view, and I always talk about the long civil rights movement, right? In terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, I've always had colleagues and students ask me, they're like, is it successful, Megan? And I'm like, you mean in 2014, like in 2007, like what, like, did you expect like police to stop killing Black people after a month? like you have to understand that this has been over a century-long fight, right? That like, but I don't think that we understand that, but I think that's in part because there's so much of our history has been sanitized, right? So much of the harm has been washed away. I want to move now to an audience question about accountability, actually, and I think that this is really interesting. So this question from one member of the audience is, what concrete steps can employees take to hold their organizations accountable to their DEI efforts? and how to embed anti-racism within the organization rather than just having a separate DEI team. And I'm going to add to this just a little bit here because I think it's interesting, right? And so I've been paying attention, obviously, to the Academy, to Philanthropy. I get some newsletters about some impact investing, right? I also hear a lot from my friends in the corporate world. And there's all these new kind of statements around what new things organizations, right, nonprofit and private, are going to be doing in this moment to address this. And so, like, what are steps that individuals working at these organizations, at these educational institutions, what can we do? I need y'all's advice to hold to hold these organizations accountable. If possible, I'm going to do Nia, Lori, Michelle, and then Theodore. About 2 minutes.
Okay. All right. So what can you do in educational institutions to hold these institutions accountable for DEI efforts? I'm trying to answer this in 2 minutes. Okay. So I think one thing that I am thinking about is Ujima, and again, we do this in partnership with other orgs. We have a Divest Invest campaign. And so just when I think about educational institutions, and again, Ruth Simmons alluded or talked about this a little bit in her remarks. I think there's room to challenge institutions on their endowments, challenge institutions on just where they are placing their money, and how that contradicts the statements that they make about themselves. So I think this is, for me, this would be one of those the difference between walk and talk. And so I would say employees at these institutions can ask those questions. And I would say the effect is the effect of sunlight, essentially. These practices have benefited from some level of mystification, some level of, I think Lori, one of you talked about reifying. So some level of reification. I can't remember which panelist talked about this. And so that's just one thing, just a little off the cuff with a little bit of the time that I have, that I would say that I would point employees to, is and that ties to our work, is looking at the endowments of these institutions, looking at the investments that they're making, because as they're making statements, they're also underwriting a lot of toxic practices.
Oh, that's good. Yes. Lori.
Yeah, so, well, picking up on where Nia left off, I would say that for philanthropy, I'll answer first and then I'll say some thoughts about private sector. For philanthropy, there really isn't accountability. I mean, it's just the reality of what the field is like. And so one of the things that we've been pressed with for all of this time is, where in a field where there isn't accountability, what measures can we put in place that at least move and allow some level of accountability where there, for those who are trying to be accountable, so that we have some levels where there are mechanisms and tools that they can put in place to do some of their own measuring when they have some sincerity of wanting to change. Other ways are for us to get trustees, to get folks on the boards who are really going to push and who have more of the mindset of advancing issues of racial justice. But then those folks typically also need tools to be able to do that effectively, because the reality is most of these foundations, if they get folks of color, they're getting people who have been working in other sectors and are not necessarily as connected to movement. So then there's all those layers of accountability about how do we both hold them accountable and strengthen their skill set. So in fact, a lot of what PRE and our partners do is work in these ways that strengthen the skill set of the change agents who are trying to do the movement. We don't try to delude ourselves that it's going to be because of accountability. It's going to be because people are more effective in figuring out how to do that movement. But then the other counterbalance is and then there's power being built in the broader community, and where the foundations are seeing where the win is, and they're going to recognize that they want to be connected to this. When I think about the private sector, then what is the comparable application? And I say this not having that's not my focus, but when I think about where shareholder activism can be engaged, where there can be different kinds of ways to get at the leadership and the board beyond the staff leadership, or when I look at what we are able to do effectively publicly with boycotting. And I think about where we had the most effectiveness of Color of Change coming in after Trayvon Martin was murdered, and really mobilized communities to get so many of the corporations that were backing ALEC with its conservative legislation manufacturing that had been being tackled for a long time. So I use that often as an example of the effectiveness in the philanthropic sector to focus on funding groups like Color of Change that are going to really get it. But also when I think about the private sector, we have the power perhaps to move there as well.
Great, thanks so much. Michelle?
Yeah, so, when I think about how I have done this work as a racial justice practitioner, how many of the folks in my community, how we do this work collectively, two things come to mind. The first is, kind of what I call compassionate accountability, right? So Lori, you're talking about this accountability. There has to be this accountability for sure, and that is so deeply connected to metrics. It is connected to codified language. It is, if this is the strategic plan, what are the goals? What are the things that we can quantify and the things that we can qualify that allow us to say, if we know this is better practice relative to organizing, or if we know this is better practice relative to participatory anything, then how have we made sure that that's been baked into the way that we do our work, right? So there's that compassionate accountability, right? But then there's the rigorous love, right? Which is to say that love is or justice is what love looks like in public, right? And so when we say that, it's like these things, they are rooted absolutely in action, and they are rooted absolutely in action that everyone should be able to perceive and should be replicable within any organization, right? So getting back to some of the technology, if you will, of folks who deal in recruitment and retention and talent development and all of that, like what I hear from you, Lori, is this idea of capacity building. And so much of that is just rooted in, I want you to live out and be who you need to be in this work. And in order to do that, I have to hold you to a certain level of excellence relative to rigor, right? And rigor is about discipline. But the third piece that we're talking about, so compassion, accountability, rigorous love, is fortitude. When I think specifically about the private sector, I get back to this point that this is not about trendy things to take on. This is not about what statement have you put out, what letter have you signed, what role have you filled in your organization, but it's about a level of professional and institutional fortitude, right? And as a country that, has thrived on narratives relative to, westward expansion and rugged individualism and, and within the private sector, innovation and, agile technology, and how do we pivot it? How do we meet the market? And how do we make the market? And all of this, some of this is just like, that's true. And that's right. We have to be resilient, right? But there's a part of this that is about fortitude, which is how do we, with our burgeoning consciousness around what is so, commit to something regardless of what the market, the shareholders, our other members of the C-suite of the management team, our folks who are lobbying with and for us for funding in the private sector, how do we maintain some actual commitment to that which is right and that which is just and that which is necessary in order for us not to be talking about, those high points, right? And Megan, you were talking about like, is it successful? Like, have we done it yet? Have we won yet? And it's like, no, and it's not going to happen in our lifetimes. Real talk. Like, if I'm being honest, we're not going to dismantle racism in our lifetimes, but our job is to keep pushing and pressing and to raise consciousness such that once we know a thing collectively, we cannot unknow that thing.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, Theodore, I'm gonna go to you, but there's an audience question that came in specifically asking for your expertise here. So I'm also gonna throw that on the table here, which is this audience member's question is, what is the key or perhaps the secret to having real racial inclusion in the Brazilian context, in Brazilian companies? So I'm going to also throw that question to you. Theodore, the mute.
Sorry again. Yes, I think the top management will set the tone about this diversity and inclusion. And diversity and inclusion, it's not something nice to have, you know, it's like fashion, like you mentioned. It's like a muscle. We have to exercise it every single day, because there's a threat that are called the autopilot. If we don't do anything all the time, it will go back to the way it was before. And we really have to insist, like Michelle said for many, many years before really we can change something in the right direction. And so I say the top should be the example, and it should be part of the agenda and the board meetings, executive meetings. The company should set targets and goals. In my opinion, it should also be bonus relevant for the executives, so that all this, the inclusion diversity issue becomes really part of the company, of the DNA. What I saw many times in Brazil is that we see a lot of CEOs that want to be on the picture. They don't want to do the movie. And we need CEOs that help making the movie. And another thing they need to do is they have to put their heart into this business. It's like courage. And the word courage means acting with your heart. And there's a problem with the white male executives, is that we don't talk about this in our schools, in our universities. It is like it's a bad thing if a top executive shows a little bit of his emotions and his heart. But what you see in the company is that the employees, they want to see a more sensitive board that is really concerned about the issues of the country and the company in terms of people. So this is really a win-win situation. If you do it right, everybody will gain from this. And then I was thinking for the right word, because Nia mentioned ESG, and that race should be something separate, right? Something like that. And I would say that we should call this like racial compliance, or moral compliance, or social compliance. Companies spend millions and millions of dollars in compliance every year. And whenever you need a budget to do inclusion, diversity and inclusion, there's always no budget. And that's one of the explanations companies give why they do not move forward. It's not high on the agenda. So whenever there's a budget cut, the first thing they might cut is probably these type of expenses, and then they will leave this for next year. And so this is something that we really have to get on the table to make the executives more accountable for this, and that they will really use this, like I said, like a muscle. And there's another thing, I don't know in the US, but at least in Brazil, this does not happen, is in the Wall Street. What do companies publish in their annual reports concerning diversity and inclusion? Do they go all the detail in terms of race and in which position the Black people are in the companies, for example? And this is something I think we have to work on. So companies will also disclose the statistics, and also you can see how this will be evolving in the future. Yeah. And so basically, I mean, this is what I wanted to say. In the case of Brazil, I think it's maybe a bit different, because in Brazil we have a lot of local companies, very big companies, family businesses, also from private owners, and they're far behind compared to multinationals. The multinationals in Brazil, the American multinationals, are much more advanced because they have this from the US, affirmative action activities from the US. The European companies, they're much more focused on gender. But I think now they're also moving forward with the race issue, because as we have seen also in the news after the tragedies in the US, also in Europe, we have seen a lot of people coming up and talking about institutional racism. So in Brazil, many times people say that in Brazil the problem is it's not race, it's social. And I tend to say it is social because it's racism. Because of racism, we have inequality, and not the other way around. And I can tell from the Dutch activists that I've interacted with, in Holland, you see a lot of Black people with excellent education, but they still get discriminated at work. They have the same problems we have in Brazil in terms of institutional racism. So this issue is really, in my sincere opinion, it should be the first topic on the World Economic Forum. We have to approach this from a global perspective. And you see all these young people also getting together. There's also an initiative called Global Black Youth.
Theodore, we had.
Yes. Yeah, my time is up.
You got 10 seconds. Yep.
Yeah, okay.
All right, we're going to go to our last part, if that's okay.
I think I said enough. Okay, thank you.
Okay, fantastic. All right, we're going to head to our last question. Here, I'm going to give the panelists 30 seconds to 1 minute to answer, which is a final thought, or kind of what I had down here was, what is your call to action to this community of leaders, educators, students, philanthropists, people in government, nonprofit executives, corporate leaders, as we start rebuilding our nation? If I could go, Michelle, Theodore, Lori, and Nia.
Yeah, so I guess I double down on folks need to call for truth, right? We need to call for truth, and we need to call for, in light of the fact that, how do I put this gingerly? Our work as a Center for Racial Justice is being specifically threatened in terms of teaching the reality of history, in terms of asking folks, demanding that folks develop an anti-racist lens, right? Folks who have nothing to say publicly and much to say privately must speak publicly and privately about what they understand. Audre Lorde tells us that our silence will not protect us.
Excellent. Theodore? That mute.
I think, yes, I don't want to be repetitive, because I really think that the leaders, the first thing they should do is talk to the people. They should go out and meet the people in the company, the Black people in the company, and in the slums, and really get a close look to what happens in the country. And then they will realize how much they can do as a company, as a person, as a human being, but also as a top executive, how much you can influence society by helping with the progress of the country that you're working in. And I think that this is what I would say, that we should expect from the new leaders to do in the future.
Great. Lori?
Yeah, I really think that a huge piece is going to be recognizing where the skills are, where the investments need to be for the demographics that across the world we should be addressing. And so even when Michelle mentioned earlier, I said something about capacity building, I said in the chat, I want to make sure people knew, I was talking about the foundation's lack of capacity. I was saying it's their capacity, right, that's missing. But I think there's also this moment where we really know who has different skill sets that are needed, and it is about effectiveness. It is about merit. It is about where the resources should go, and we just need to invest further there, and maybe not on the failures of constantly trying to change white organizations.
Nia?
Yeah, so there are two things that both Theo and Michelle have said that are jumping out at me. So one, Theo used the word exercise, and Michelle, in a previous response, you talked about relations and power dynamics. And so what I would say is practice directly following Black and Latinx organizing leadership. Commit to it, do it, move beyond statements, note your reservations. Some of them are fair, some of them are not, and let them go. Create safe systems, create safe spaces for Black and Latinx leadership to critique you and your efforts, and genuinely listen without reacting defensively. Learn, do it again, practice, learn, revise, do it again, and repeat it until relationships have transformed enough that we are in co-equal partnership. The thing that I want to mention really quickly is Ujima is part of a coalition along with Black Economic Council of Massachusetts, City Life Vita Urbana, North American Indian Center of Boston, King Boston, and Young Abolitionists. We've created a document in response to getting a lot of calls from people saying, what do we do? It's called a blueprint for the new world. We have a bunch of different recommendations for private sector, nonprofit, philanthropy, and state and local governments. And I'm gonna just call out my favorite one for you, Lori, in the philanthropy sector, which is reapportion 1% of assets for the purchases of land across the Commonwealth for Black and Indigenous farmers, residents, and business owners to develop, grow, produce, and manufacture goods, food, and services. So I'm just thinking every foundation should have a land program. And I'll end with that.
Oh, I love this. I love all of it. You see how we ran out of time, everyone? Yeah. My deep gratitude to my 4 panelists. Thank you so much for the challenges that you've given all of us and for all the labor and the work that you are doing. We are in great debt. With that, I will turn it over. Take care, everyone.